Founders Forum, episode 17.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Founders Forum. In today's episode, Cole and I are going to be speaking with Dr. Mark Thornton of the Mises Institute. Let me just read a little bit from his official bio. Mark Thornton is the Peterson-Luddy Chair in Austrian Economics and a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He serves as the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. His publications include The Economics of Prohibition in 91, Tariffs, Blockades, and Inflation, The Economics of the Civil War, 2004, The Quotable Mises, 2005. I'm skipping some of these. The last one here I'll read is The Skyscraper Curse and How Austrian Economists Predicted Every Major Crisis of the Last Century in 2018. And so what we've got Mark on for this episode is to talk about, the state of the economy. And in particular, we focus a lot on real estate. And as that last book title suggested, that's something Mark knows a lot about. Also, we get into his successful predictions of the last big housing bubble and burst. And I read some of the things he said in real time back when the conventional wisdom would scoff at him and say he was crazy. So without further ado, here is the non-crazy Mark Thornton. Mark, welcome to the Founders Forum podcast.
Hey, Bob, it's great to be with you.
Well, let me set the stage for people. So we're going to be starting out and talking to you about your economic outlook, but I want to explain to people why they should take you seriously. So here is an article you wrote called Housing Too Good to Be True. And this was from back in 2004. And you say there's signs of a new era in housing, and some people say it's too good to be true. And then you say, in fact, it is too good to be true. And you go on to say that Greenspan has indicated that interest rates could soon reverse their course, while longer-term interest rates have already moved higher. Higher interest rates should trigger a reversal in the housing market and expose the fallacies of the new paradigm, including how the housing boom has helped cover up increases in price inflation. Unfortunately, this exposure will hurt homeowners, and the larger problem could hit the American taxpayer, who could be forced to bail out the banks and government-sponsored mortgage guarantors who have encouraged irresponsible lending practices. So again, that was from 2004. Now, as I read it now, it doesn't seem that earth-shattering, but there was a period, Mark, where, I don't know if you know this, I was going around giving presentations to be like in 2000, late 2008, early 2000, 2009, let's say. So that, just after the financial crisis hit. And I was going through my, all charts and everything showing. And then I showed some quotes like to validate, to say, hey, this isn't just me like Monday morning quarterbacking, blaming the Fed for the housing bubble. There were people in real estate, and I had like a Ron Paul quote. And then I had yours up there, and the crowd was like, oh, wow. And the reason it was so surprising is because so many people were saying when this happened in 2008, who could have seen this coming? This is amazing. Everything seemed fine. Like, you can't blame us. And yet I had that quote from you from 2004 saying this is going to collapse. This is not going to be good.
Yeah, actually, I had an article where I mentioned this in late 2003. I didn't get much pushback at that point, but the 2004 article, I did get a lot of pushback. People thought I was crazy. People thought I was nuts. And I actually did a public presentation in early 2005 where I was kind of mocking my critics. And it was at Auburn University. And instead of the students showing up, it was developers, builders, bankers. Those people showed up on campus. I felt kind of threatened at that point. And that's, I think, the only time I felt threatened for what I said about the economy, but it was an hysteria. It was a psychological thing. At some point, everybody becomes invested, literally, but also mentally, in a mania like that. And it was very uncomfortable at the time because we hadn't had a significant housing bubble in quite a while. But now, of course, we're right back in one.
Cole, were you in Canada when all that was going down?
Sure was, yeah.
Was it similar up there? Was there a mania and people denying what now looked obvious?
Yeah, 100%. And a lot of the contagion that happens in Canada is not necessarily a result of, say, economic fiscal mismanagement as much as it's, well, if it's happening in the US, it must be happening to us. So there's this kind of there was this phantom bubble almost that existed. It's this very strange thing. Like, Canadians don't watch Canadian news, they watch American news. So they got hysterical, not because of actual underlying economic mismanagement, but because they just felt like, okay, this must be happening here too. So let's act in kind.
Yeah, Canada experienced the same thing, but they didn't have a real burst in their bubble the way it happened in the United States. And frankly, I went to Europe in 2005, and I didn't recognize that they were having a bubble as well in Ireland and England and other places. I just thought that's the way it always was over there because I was brand new to it. I'd never been to Europe. And so seeing is just not good enough to understanding whether it's an artificial bubble or a real expansion. It's just not good enough. Seeing is not really the be all and end all of whether or not you're in a bubble or whether it's going to crash.
Well, can you give the listeners maybe some ideas of why back in 2003, even 2004, 2005, when everybody else thought you were nuts, were you so confident that you were willing to publicly stick your neck out and receive such scorn?
Well, I think it was the low interest rate environment that was in place because of the tech bubble bust. And so housing was doing well in 19 and 00 and in the early years. And then it benefited because people shifted towards housing and real estate and real things rather than just technology. And they could do that because of the low interest rate environment that was occurring at the time. So I was looking at particular anomalies in my neighborhood that were going on in terms of home sales and housing prices. And so I started taking a look at the national statistics. And that's where you can visualize things a little bit in the sense that you can see big upswings and movements off of trend lines and that sort of thing. So that it really takes a lot of different pieces to identify a bubble. You have to see everything from bricks and mortar, people moving around, jobs and industries shifting, aggregate statistics, and psychological issues too, because it was a time where no matter what, if there was any bad news about housing, it was always spun in a positive direction. And people were saying, you can't lose money in real estate. Housing prices never go down. Things, when you see the word never or always in economic terms, a big question mark should pop up in your head.
Right. When I first started at one point in my life, I was a licensed financial advisor, and I was worried about the word guaranteed. The fear of God was put into me to not say that word, guaranteed. Guaranteed, nothing is guaranteed. I'm like, what am I doing here? Then what is this? What is this all about? Mark, I just wanted to ask you, in current times today, housing bubble, real estate bubble, say commercial versus residential, is there a big difference? Is there risk on one side or the other? And what does that look like in today's landscape?
I think that's a great question. It's an important question. And the answer, I think, is, to me at least, is somewhat obvious. I wrote about the real estate bubble in 2021, I believe, that the housing market had reignited into a bubble and that the growth of commercial construction was already really in a bubble at that point. We had been in a very low interest rate environment. The Fed had followed a zero interest rate policy for 8 years and a quantitative easing policy that saw the Fed buy up trillions of dollars of government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. And then COVID hit, and the Fed threw everything at it, the kitchen sink and everything else imaginable that they might have at the Fed. They threw it at the marketplace. They drove credit conditions to unbelievably low interest rates and credit availability, and the government was handing out money like crazy. And that's when the sort of the final burst of the real estate construction mania took place. And so when I'm looking right now at a housing market in the United States that is in limbo because of what the Fed had done and is doing, and commercial real estate, my visual image of that is that commercial real estate is just readily available, still highly priced. If you want to lease it, it's still, the prices are still up there, the leasing rates, but there seems to be just an enormous amount of availability in terms of commercial real estate. And they're finding out that people are really not flooding back into the office. Even Amazon is hurting, but I don't see that trend going away or completely reversing itself. So I see some really, really tough times ahead in terms of commercial real estate for people who really haven't already sort of signed long-term agreements with reliable tenants. The market does not all just go away at once, but certainly certain segments and areas are going to be facing a lot of hard times, tough times. They're going to really have to really reinvent this marketplace. There's some older commercial real estate, office buildings and so forth that are just entering the market, just coming back out into like auctions, bankruptcy. And frankly, they're not doing all that well. The Union Building in San Francisco just was recently auctioned off, and it showed a 75% loss of value. Of course, San Francisco and the city government, of course, have enormous local problems that are unique to that marketplace. But the supply exceeds the demand right now by a significant amount, and prices are just now starting to reflect the changing conditions, the post-COVID conditions.
Yeah, we were, Mark, just at a conference where there was a lot of real estate investors. And, I don't remember the exact statistics off the top of my head, but one of the speakers was rattling off certain areas, like major urban centers where the vacancy rates were like 50% or something just ridiculous as far as commercial.
Yeah.
I know, but yeah, they've been building quite a bit. I mean, again, my local conditions are such that we've seen up until now a great deal of expansion in terms of commercial, retail, office space, and apartments and condos in our local market, which I'm most familiar with. So right now we're going through a process of digestion where some of those places are getting tenants, but the landlords are obviously going to have to be reducing the prices in the contracts that they're offering, and that those prices that they're offering now are going to be far less, or at least significantly less than what the projects anticipated on paper when they were first undertaken. I haven't seen anything that would indicate that they've incurred excess costs in the process, but I can imagine that it was difficult for them to get labor and materials. We did see lumber and construction good prices certainly rise at various points over the upswing. So their costs may be higher, but their revenues for current leases that are going into effect are going to be, at least I would anticipate, in aggregate that they're going to be lower than when those projects first went onto paper and first broke ground.
Yeah. This is an interesting conversation. If you look at, let's say, COVID, for example, building, because of your point about building materials and availability of labor and just regional shutdowns of all kind of operations. So commercial real estate, new builds, obviously what came to a real slowdown, if not a total freeze in some states. So you had less commercial, say, square footage being built across America, North America, Canada. You had a bunch of people that were asked to kind of stay home. Now they don't want to necessarily come back to work. So and then you had, there's some, technology is always kind of moving forward. And why are these commercial spaces empty? Say there's not as many of them. There's not as much commercial, say, square footage available because of COVID. Why is there such high vacancy rates?
Well, part of it is all the building that's been going on now for over 20 years.
Yeah, even though it was slowed down during COVID.
Right. But commercial construction is supposed to be around for at least a 25-year planning horizon. And what we're seeing right now actually is that the new projects are finding tenants. They are moving people in slower and at lower rates. But we're finding the old skyscrapers of 2 or 3 or 4 cycles ago, they're having tremendous problems in older urban areas like New York, like Louisville, Kentucky, like San Francisco, like Cincinnati, where these older office buildings, they've lost their main tenant who's built their own little skyscraper, and they're losing tenants to newer construction. And so they're going under and they're having to be auctioned off. They're having to go through bankruptcy. And this is the type of raw material that's going to build our next economic expansion. But right now, we're kind of in the early stages of consolidation going into a downturn in real estate, at least in the aggregate. I mean, they're still building houses in Auburn. They're still building houses and condos and apartments in Florida. They're still building real estate in Austin, Texas. So there are places where people are moving to in economic expanding in local areas. But I think in aggregate, what we're going to find is that particularly in older markets that, again, this supply is going to greatly exceed demand. People have been unsatisfied with people returning to the office type work, although it is happening, and it's happening in large numbers, but it's not 100%. People have realized that for many job descriptions, being able to work from home and flexibility time actually enhances the job, even if they're coming into the office 3 or 4 days a week. So there is a decrease in the demand for these things. And so, again, the supply exceeds the demand and prices have to fall below what was anticipated in all the original plans and what the projections were for these construction projects. And of course, they're also finding out, much to my chagrin, is that a lot of this real estate is very difficult to reconstruct or reconstitute in other forms. So, for example, office buildings in New York, they're finding because of the construction requirements and regulations that it's very difficult to renovate them for apartments or condos or other uses. So there's no easy substitution. Those are precisely the type of issues that are raised in the Austrian School of Economics about the business cycle, is that you cannot easily convert old capital into new capital costlessly. And therefore, you do have to go through this process of reinventing the economy and reinventing every little piece of that economy, including buildings and structures and houses and everything that goes with that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Mark. I was going to ask you at some point, so this is a natural segue. can you contrast like the dominant, like I think what the average American and Canadian presumably gets from the TV or, reading the business journals and whatnot is some Keynesian analysis, but they might even use that term. It's just taken for granted that, oh yeah, there's spending isn't enough. And so the central bank has to cut interest rates. And if that's not enough, then the government needs to come in and, deficit spend and, it's overheating, better raise interest rates. And that's obviously not the Austrian paradigm. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the background to that is that now the Fed has backed itself into a corner where we already have high inflation. So any move to cut rates prematurely, I think, would do major damage to, for example, the dollar. And so then you would just shift the problem to our currency, which is not an idle threat, and that's not an inconsequential thing. You can't just devalue your dollar and expect everything to be hunky-dory. So that is a problem, and unfortunately, the media, the general media that people are exposed to on television and the internet and newspapers of old and even radio, they don't really get back to the problem. And so the Keynesian type of solutions seem okay and seem to make sense. I was looking at the housing market. I read maybe a dozen different articles this week about housing in particular and the particular problems that it's facing right now, which are very unusual. In fact, I'm not sure if I've ever seen anything like it before. But to your point, Bob, not one person mentioned in all of those articles anything about the Fed, anything about their more than a decades long period of ultra low, historically never tried before in history, interest rates, in which crazy things were happening, like negative interest rates in the world. So we had negative interest rates. We even had negative oil prices because of what the Fed was doing to make our markets crazy. And yet you fast forward just a few years and you talk about the housing market and none of those people. And I was reading, business publications, general interest publications, and they never mentioned the underlying fundamental problem that was messing up these markets.
Are you referring, Mark, to, in case some of the listeners don't remember the reference, was it like May of 2020 or something when the oil prices went negative? Was it right with the COVID? And what he's referring to is like wherever they were unloading the thing. Like, again, it's right when COVID really, the lockdowns and everything happened. And there was this crazy it was brief, but it was a real thing where the people who were delivering barrels of oil, like they had such a glut, they were paying people to take their barrels from them. So oil was literally negative for, a brief period there.
Absolutely. And it's never, ever, ever happened.
So Mark, can you just elaborate a little bit on, in the Austrian view then, like, so for the Keynesians, like the interest rates are like this lever, or sometimes they literally, that's not us putting words in it, they will liken it to a car and, you step on the gas or then you pump the brakes or and the Austrian view, interest rates, their prices, they have a job to do. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but can you just explain like why from an Austrian perspective, you're not doing the economy any favors by pushing interest rates down to ridiculously low levels?
Yeah, I think that the basic difference is that Austrians have an appreciation for the way the world is and how it works, at least to a certain degree. I mean, we don't know the intimate details of every business, but we appreciate the fact of what's going on and that there's all sorts of mutual agreements and interactions that take place in order that I can show up at a McDonald's and get a cup of coffee or a cheeseburger or wherever. Whereas the Keynesians have a very simplistic view. They don't really have any concern for how the economy operates. They just want to either give it more gas. And if it overheats, they want to pull back on the accelerator. And that basic accelerator is either the Fed lowering interest rates or raising interest rates. And the government's counterparty to that is they either increase spending or they decrease spending, or they might borrow money the way they did during COVID on a never before seen peacetime scale, or they cut back on it, which they're supposedly talking about today in Washington, D.C. And the way they measure that, the impact, the odometer, how fast the economy is going, is by consumer spending. So are they spending more or spending less? And so it's a very, very simplistic view of the way the world works. And we all know, and we all admit, even the Keynesians admit that it's a much more complex phenomenon. They just simply refuse to acknowledge that, whereas the Austrians, our whole game is acknowledging that, and that we want to see prices stable, that prices communicate information, that prices allow interactions, transactions, exchange, contracts to take place. And it's very important that that whole process between the hundreds of millions of us and really billions of us to take place. And they simply disregard that. They don't really care about the entrepreneur. They don't really care about a business owner. They show empathy, or at least they declare empathy for the worker, but the worker is just as abused in this whole process of the business cycle, the artificial business cycle, as everybody else. And I think when we look at the housing market today, and we see a lot of frustrations, we see prices still very, very high, much higher than the previous housing bubble, for example, and prices have only come down a very small amount. So if you were to look at a graph, housing prices really skyrocketed during the original housing bubble, and they came down a lot, and now they've gone up much, much higher than the previous housing bubble, and they've only come down just by a smidgen. And people still need to move. They still need to start families. There's all sorts of frustrations out there. There's no supply of housing out there such that people are still building new houses in the economy because there's not enough inventory on the market to satisfy new couples, new households, people moving to better jobs, all sorts of the normal things that people want to do. They want to downsize, or they starting a family, they want a bigger house. And all of these people are being frustrated. And it's largely because, again, the Fed's ultra low interest rate policy for 12 years, and that translates into ultra low mortgage interest rates and payments. So if you got a mortgage at 3.5%, which when I was growing up, there was no such thing like that, but be that as it may, 3.5% mortgage, and if you were to sell your house and try to buy another one and get a new mortgage, well, you're talking about a doubling of the interest rate. You're talking about a payment. Again, if you stick with the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, is going to be much, much higher for the same house. So you, in effect, if you want to move, you have to, and you want the same payment, you have to be willing to accept a much smaller house. And so you don't sell, you don't move. And thus, that explains why there's such a limited, very limited supply of housing on the market at this time. And that's kept prices up for now, but it's frustrating at the microeconomic level. And no one, and that was barely touched on in the stories that I talked about. And the ultimate cause of it being the Federal Reserve's previous low interest rate stimulative policy. Nobody really carries that story over to the current situation where they've raised rates. I mean, the rates are not historically high, but they've increased the rates. They've doubled the rates on mortgages. So again, all of this game playing by the Keynesians and the game playing by politicians and central bankers is having a real world on the ground households. It's a frustrating situation for both buyers and sellers and people who want to move, people who have job opportunities in better markets. It's really messing things up because they don't appreciate the real workings of the economy on Main Street.
Mark, I have a number of friends, to your point, who are, I would say, small to medium size, like turnkey retail real estate investors. They buy, they're landlords, they rent things out, trying to get good tenants. So they're up against it because they're currently buying at today's interest rates, and they recognize they're across Canada, across the United States. And a lot of them, what they've been doing, and it's actually become very, very popular, is this like rental arbitrage. So they're not buying anymore. They're going out and renting now, long term. They're getting the right lease. They find the right landlord, and they're putting things on Airbnb or VRBO. I don't even know how to say it. Verbo? Is that how the kind of a strange word name for a company? Verbo or VRBO, whatever. They've got me talking about it anyway. It must be a good brand. Now talking about it for 30 seconds. So that company, and that's what they're doing. They don't even want to own anymore. Now it's all because they just want the cash flow for it. So they're renting something for, say, $2,500 or $3,000 a month. It may be close to a beach. It may have a pool. It has something. And then, they freshen it all up. They do a year plus an option, 2 years plus an option with a landlord, and they put it on Airbnb and they cash flow it. They hire a property manager to come in and flip it and clean it. When the new tenants leave, they put it on Airbnb, and, they may make $1,000 to $1,500 dead net profit a month, and they're happy. This is just kind of where it's at. And it kind of begs the question, and something that I've been really interested in. It's kind of an age-old question when it comes to, say, buying or renting. Is one better than the other? Do you have an opinion on that? I mean, are people better off to rent? Are they better off to buy? Any thoughts around that?
Well, I grew up in an era where the American dream, a big part of it was owning your own home. And so I'm not going to badmouth that, but I will say that as time has gone on and as society has changed and just the nature of the economy has changed, I no longer believe that, and really never believe that, the government should be promoting that artificially. And I think in modern times where people, I grew up in an era where you were born in a place, you lived in a place, you worked in a place, the same place, and then they put you in the ground after about 70 years.
The same place.
In that same place. Yeah. So why not own your own home? But we don't live in that world anymore. And I think flexibility is such that if you're not a saver, that you want to maintain that flexibility. Now, I think even I would probably accept your model that you just described, in the sense that I would buy a place and live in a place, and if I had to move, I'd just move and rent the place out and become a landlord. I am a landlord, so I don't have any problem with that. And I think increased flexibility right now more than ever is a key. So that whole population is going to need apartments, condos, short-term, medium-term, long-term rentals. And so I don't have any problem with that. I think it's a good way to live, in the sense that flexibility is so important now, where even if you had a career in one place, you might have to go someplace else for 6 months or 2 years as part of your career. So on the supply side of that, I'm a big proponent of that. But the problem right now is with these short-term and rentals and longer-term rentals is, are you going to be able to fill those places?
Yeah.
And right now, because of the stubbornly high prices for houses and condominiums, that people are being forced to rent, and rental rates are still very high too. So right now things look good, but whether or not you're going to be able to continually fill those spaces with renters is an open question. I know that I've already seen some weaknesses in those acronyms that you just tried to pronounce.
Yeah, whatever that is.
That
yeah.
I'm equally, whatever that is, yeah. Rent
What are they-
or whatever.
Can I say on top of all that too, it's even if you have tenants, it's not obvious they're going to pay you. Because I mean, there's some horror, and I know some places are worse than others, but I've heard read horror story that somebody will move in and then they just stop paying rent after the first or second month. And it can be years plus before, it happened during COVID was when it really got bad, where like there's a moratorium. No, we're not evicting people. So there's, again, places, and it's not even just, the guy lost his job. There's cases where the tenants move in knowing that's what their plan is going to be. Like, I'll live here at least, I bet you I'll live here at least a year before they actually kick me out. And,
right.
So that's another wild card too, as to why you might be,
Yeah, blue states and blue countries. That's a very real thing. I recently in Toronto rented an apartment, and the vacancy, the inventory is so low for nice apartments. The landlords are demanding all the rent paid up front. So there's two issues. Inventories are really low, and their landlords are petrified. Canada's a very blue country. They're petrified of people moving in and doing exactly, and gaming landlords, knowing, okay, I'm going to pay my first and my last month's rent, and I'm going to park myself here until they kick me out. And it may take 18 months for them to get, and a great expense to kick people out. It's next to impossible. So what landlords are doing in, say, slightly above average apartments right now in Toronto and Miami, I have a place also in Miami, they're asking for 12 months of rent up front. They can do this, and they're getting away with it. Criminal record check, background check, job letter, net worth statement. I had my CFO of actually the company that bought write a letter, screenshots of our bank accounts. And this is to get an apartment that was $4,500 a month. This is I guess that's a lot for some people and not a lot for others, but that's what the apartment was. It was a 1-bedroom. I was getting it for one of my staff. He was relocating, and that's what I had to do. So I had to write the check for 12 months. And he still didn't want to rent it to me. He had to actually check out one of my landlords in the Bahamas who he happened to know because he was a developer, and my friend Jason vouched for me and said, and so he's like, okay, ding, ding, you win, you get the apartment. I'm like, well, thanks. Like it was next to impossible. So yeah, to your point, but he wasn't worried about the money. He was worried about me parking myself there for the next 3 to 5 years. Well, I've already got 1 year paid for. Now I could probably get him for another 2 or 3 without paying rent. And he's probably still worried about it.
Yeah. And this is not just an idle threat out there, and it has potentially catastrophic consequences. And let me just draw you a pretty simple timeline here, is that currently both the United States and Canada and many other countries around the world have very blue, very left-wing political leadership. And during the Great Depression, this was also a problem. People couldn't pay their rent for a lot of different things, and they couldn't make their mortgage payment in a lot of different states. And so many states, it's not in the history book because it was a state level moratorium on foreclosures and kicking out tenants. And as a consequence of that, a lot of landlords went bankrupt and a lot of banks went under. And that's one of the main things that made the Great Depression so great, in the sense that it was so bad for so long, is that the empathy that we all have, if it just stops at the tenant, okay, I'm empathetic to the tenant. I don't want to see bad things happen to the tenant, but nobody has the same empathy for the landlord who has to make his bills, or the bank who has to make his books or her books. And so if the legislation only looks at the surface, and then they pass these moratoriums on collecting on mortgages and collecting on leases, it can really cause a system-wide failure. And so, and we do have the type of politicians in office in Canada and the United States and so many other countries who that's all they're looking at is skin deep, surface deep. They're not looking beyond what Keynesians look at, which again is just the surface of things. They don't look below the surface. And so they're liable to back into a catastrophic situation just because they're concerned with particular individuals and not concerned with the way the economy actually functions and must function. There's no workaround on these types of issues.
Raising the issue, Mark, of like how severe things are going to be, I agree with you that I have a book on the Great Depression, and I would clarify, because a lot of times even some Austrians kind of might say loosely, oh yeah, the Fed caused the Great Depression. And I would say, well, the Fed caused the boom, and then in the 20s and the bust, it was Herbert Hoover and then FDR's policies that made it last for a decade and just be awful. This same conference that Cole and I were recently at, Peter Schiff was a speaker there. I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically said, if the housing bubble that burst and caused all the problems in '08 was due to a year of interest rates being at 1%, meaning the Fed funds rate from '03 to '04, look at what the Fed has done since after the financial crisis, then COVID. So how bad, if you think that the Fed had something to do with the housing bubble that burst in '08, then look at the seeds they've sown for what's coming, is kind of what he was getting at. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Well, they could become extremely bad. It all depends on who's sitting in charge of all this. Who's the president? Who's the legislature? What are the voters' mindsets? So if Bob Murphy was president, I wouldn't be as worried as I am right now, because I don't think the American public, although I should say, I think the American public, the American electorate, I think even other countries, I think Canada is becoming a little more concerned about its leadership, and they're realizing that they can't go on with this mentality. But the leadership itself is still doesn't have the proper mindset of fixing the situation. So the buildup, the backlog of bad loans, bad credit, bad projects is in the extreme, I would say right now, because of the length and depth of interest rates and policy. And you have the Fed that's sitting on trillions of dollars of new assets that it's bought. But its assets, they bought up a third of the mortgage market, and they doubled their holdings of government bonds in the process, and they're having difficulties. They can't restructure their balance sheet. The Fed is now in the red for the first time, I think, ever, to the tune of close to $100 billion that they're losing on their balance sheet right now. So the balance sheets in America, the individual balance sheets, consumer debt right now is at an all-time high. Credit card debt is spiked back way up. Mortgage debt is at an all-time high. And so the fuel there for the problem is absolutely enormous. And I don't think we have the people to fight the fire that is currently started and underway. And we have a lot to work through. And the bank failures that we've seen, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in New York and Third Republic Bank, these are a little bit unique situations, but they're really cutting edge situations. They're the leading edges. And all three of those are huge banks. They refer to them as the regional banks as if they don't matter, but it still represents three of the four largest bank failures in that category in history. So the problem is really big. And what is the FDIC supposed to bail out the entire banking industry? They've already pledged to bail out all depositors of any size and any amount in the United States. But that's ammunition that they don't have. And so I think the problem is very, very large.
Yeah, Mark, I really appreciate, obviously, having you on the show today. I took a lot away from it. I think that there's a big message here for our viewers and for our listeners. It's get out and do something about it. I mean, I think the message for me was educate yourself really about what's actually going on. Austrian economics is a big thing. Wouldn't it be nice if Austrian economics became more of a household name? And I think, is it growing, Mark? Would you say is Austrian economics kind of at scale, kind of growing? And I'll get your answer to that. And then, we'll wrap up the show and leave viewers with the desire and the ambition to go out and at least Google you and Bob, find out what you're up to.
Well, I really do think the Austrian School of Economics is growing. And most importantly, it's not just the number of PhDs and academics, but it's PhDs and academics around the world. In other words, we're not just in a few places here in the United States, but we're in many countries around the world. But even more important than that is it's individual people and citizens are waking up, and they're coming primarily to our website, which is mises.org, and it's written for regular people. So that is the important thing, is that people now, it's our saving grace, is that more people are educated. Someone was in the Institute just yesterday, and he was the exterminator for our building and doing a checkup and that sort of thing. We got to talking, and he, right there in my office, he said, well, I'm a capitalist. And he wanted to get a copy of my latest book. And he wanted to know more about it because he hadn't heard anything. But everybody, you don't have to be an exterminator in Auburn, Alabama to learn a lot more that can help you, not just be educated, but that can actually help. So I would encourage everybody to go to mises.org and keep abreast of the news with an Austrian interpretation to it, because that's going to really fortify you. It's going to help protect you. You're obviously going to have to take actions, but it's also going to mean that as a country, as a political body, we're going to be able to better deal with these hard times. And hard times always sow the seed to better times. And if we can overcome the economic problems, which I know we can, and if we can overcome the political ignorance that we're currently living in, which I also firmly believe that we can, the next expansion on a sound basis rather than an artificial basis that the Fed and the Keynesians want us to be dependent upon, it could be a great turn for all of us as individuals. Let's call it a return to sanity and the types of conditions that we want to live in. Not perfect, but eminently livable and a lot more fun.
Well, so a mixture of pessimism, or I guess you'd say realism, but also optimism there at the end, Mark. So thank you for your time. And yes, everybody, encourage you to go to mises.org. That's mises.org and look up Mark Thornton. Well, Mark, what's the name of the audio commentary that you do? The little short.
Yeah, I started a little audio commentary. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, once or twice a week. It always releases on Saturday morning on all the podcast platforms, and we tweet it out on Twitter. And it's called Minor Issues. And in the podcast, I take what the media and other economists believe are minor issues not worthy of your consideration. And I show that it's really the key to understanding the issue. It's really the most important thing that they're leaving out of that weekly story. So It's been a lot of fun. And again, it's only 5 minutes, which is almost an impossibility for an economist to explain anything in 5 minutes.
No,
but
I thought you were going to say it's almost a possibility for an economist to stop talking after 5 minutes.
Yeah, but I'm having a lot of fun with it. There's no production value to it whatsoever, but I think it's worthy of your time, and I hope everybody can, and it's all the back things are on our website, and it's minor issues, but it makes a point and it makes it quickly. And I think it's usually something that's missing but yet very important.
Yeah, I'll second that, folks. Mark, I listened to a few of those just to get prepped for this episode. And yes, it's great stuff. Like you say, little bite-sized chunks to help provide an Austrian flavor to the current events. Thank you, Mark, for your time. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. We will see you next time.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.